Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Good morning, everyone. So these are some of Jesus' more famous words, more popular words that come from the Beatitudes. And they represent Jesus' vision for a status reversal. And I think part of what makes them so memorable is that they fly in such contrast to our cultural and personal experiences. I don't know if you caught all of the movie references up there. If you did, good for you. But I think it's a fairly representative snapshot of what our culture says. That the lawyer who says the poor man can't be trusted, and that he's a part of the decay of Western society. The rich man whose daughter's about to marry a poor man saying she'll be back. When she's tired of having nothing, she'll be back. Or the businessman who says winning is better than losing, no matter the cost, no matter what it takes to get there. That over and over again, I think our culture tells us that to have is better than to not have. But beyond that, you don't have to go that far. Our personal experience tells us that. If you were to get some, kind of unexpected windfall of money, you would probably utter a phrase, something similar to, "Oh my gosh, what a blessing. What a blessing this is." How many of you have gotten a call from a debt collector before and have been like, "I'm just so blessed. This is so great. Thank you for calling." We don't have that type of experience. Same idea with hunger. I was seriously reflecting on this outside of, a few times of fasting. I don't know if I've, in my life, actually ever experienced being hungry. I've craved things. I've been kind of in some discomfort, but I haven't really been hungry. And I think that's probably fairly true of a lot of our culture, that we keep that discomfort at a distance. And even our language doesn't fit. My kids now, I don't know where they learned this or why they're doing this, but they'll come into our kitchen and be like, "I'm starving." They've never been hungry a day in their life. They haven't gone 24 hours without food. They haven't gone 2 meals without food. So what they mean by "I'm starving" is we're out of string cheese. But the language of desperation is there, except that they're not actually desperate. And I'm sort of the same way. So our experience says, hunger, not a good thing. We keep that separate. Mourning, weeping, right? Our personal experience probably tells us that happiness is better than sadness, that's something that we long for. And we go to great lengths, I think, in our lives to keep to sort of keep happiness accessible, to keep sadness, to keep mourning at a minimum, as much as we can control. To the point, now I don't think this is a bad thing, but I wonder if this is sort of a trend. I've heard this more and more recently, but for funerals to be called a celebration of life. Now again, I think that's a great sentiment. I don't disagree with it in any way, shape, or form, but I wonder if part of what is happening in wanting to even just say, no, it's a celebration of life. It is not a ritual service to come and mourn. If there's something kind of sneaky happening there of maybe I won't suffer as much. Maybe it won't be as hard if I say it's a celebration. But the reality is, if you lose somebody, that is sad. And the appropriate response is weeping, is mourning, is sadness, and a funeral exists to do that corporately. That's the purpose of it. The only true celebrating, if you were to pass on, the only true celebrating would be if you were a terrible person, if you were just an absolute jerk. And even then, that wouldn't be the most appropriate. So we do that. We keep that at a distance, I think, in our personal life, as much as we can control. And so Jesus is taking our kind of cultural voice, our personal experiences, and he's flipping it. He's flipping them over. Now, if you've been in church or kind of Christian circles long enough, you've probably heard a couple different teachings on these passages. One of which is that this is a prescriptive text, that, blessed are you when you are poor, so we should strive to be poor, or we should strive to be hungry, or we should strive to suffering, that there's something inherently valuable in that, so that we've heard it taught prescriptive. At least I've heard it taught prescriptive before, which I don't think isn't the right way to deal with this. Sort of connected to that, I've heard it taught in such a way that justifies inactivity. Right? So it allows us to say, yes, there are people who are poor, people without in our world, but it's okay. We don't need to do anything about it. God will take care of it. Or we don't need to do anything about it because they will be blessed in heaven. Right? So it sort of justifies the inactivity a little bit. And I don't know what that looks like. It's sort of like the divine marshmallow experiment. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the marshmallow experiment. It was decades ago, but researchers took little kids, put them in a room, and they would have a marshmallow in front of them. And they said, you can eat this marshmallow anytime you want, but if you wait long enough, you'll get more. You'll get extra marshmallows. I don't know how many there were after that. But if you wait, you'll get more. It's something about self-control and delayed gratification. I don't know. I was paying attention. But that's what the experiment was. So I wonder if some of the way that this text has been taught or used is something along those lines. Yes, you are starving now, but that's okay. You're blessed because you will get an all-you-can-eat buffet in heaven. I don't know where that connection is, but I've heard it taught that way. Finally, I think I've heard it sort of disregarded altogether, or in the sense that it's over-spiritualized. So this section I read came from Luke. There's a similar section in the book of Matthew. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. And so in the book of Matthew, it actually says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And so a lot of times we take that and then we look at the Luke passage and say, well, Jesus doesn't really mean blessed if you are poor. He doesn't really mean if you're hungry. But he does. He does in Luke. Like the words translated to poor is poor, and the words translated to hungry is hungry. Like it is what it means. So if these statements of Jesus are flipped, right? It's flipped from our cultural experience, from our personal experience. And if it's not prescriptive, and if it's not escapist, and if it's not sort of over-spiritualized as some type of analogy, then what is Jesus talking about? To get at that, I want to look at probably what's a little unexpected, but it's the passage right before, or the verse, not even the verse, the sentence right before it. It says, then Jesus turned to his disciples and said, blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry. So Jesus is doing something. He's busy. He's doing something. His disciples are with him. He turns, stops whatever he's doing. He turns, looks at them, and directs this teaching to them. Okay? Now, a disciple, important to know, is somebody that explicitly signed up to follow Jesus, to be like Jesus, right? They were his apprentices, right? They were learning the trade of the kingdom of God. So the expectation was they were going to do the things that Jesus did. They were going to be like Jesus. That was their goal. So Jesus is doing something. He stops and turns and he talks to them and he says, blessed are you who are poor. So the question would be, what was Jesus doing before that? And a couple sections before that, he was actually up on the mountain with his disciples, and it's like at least in Luke, it's sort of the inauguration of them. Like he's commissioning this group of apostles together. But in Luke 6:17, it says, when they came down from the mountain, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area, surrounded by many of his followers and by the crowds. There were people from all over Judea and from Jerusalem, and from as far north as the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those troubled by evil spirits were healed. Everyone tried to touch him, because healing power went out from him, and he healed everyone. So Jesus comes down from this mountainside. There's a large crowd of people, as there typically were around Jesus. And he goes and enters into the crowd. Specifically, it says into a large level area. So everyone is on the same level ground, kind of closing in around him. Mike last week used the analogy of like Tom Brady after the Super Bowl with the reporters. I don't know if anybody saw that. It was very uncomfortable to watch if you watched it live. But yeah, you'll see this crowd of reporters pressing in on Tom Brady. Like everybody's leaning in. Which, side note, if these are like $1,000 cameras, I have no idea how this makes a big difference for your shot. Like, I'm pretty sure that guy over there is just getting like a mole on the side of his neck. So I don't know why they're pressing in, reporters-wise, but they were. But I think this fits as a good sort of visual of what it was like around Jesus. He's on level ground, and a crowd probably much bigger than this is pressing in on him. Except for instead of reporters looking for a photo, these are people who are hurting, who are sick, who are diseased, who are desperate, trying to reach out and touch him to be healed. And so you'd imagine that it would be very uncomfortable. And there would probably be coughing and sneezing and bleeding and crying and wailing and all sorts of just uncomfortable things happening, closing in this sort of spirit of desperation. So put yourself in the disciples' shoes. Jesus is around this mob of people closing in desperation, trying to be healed, all sorts of stuff happening, all sorts of sounds and smells and whatever. And Jesus stops, and he turns, and he looks at his disciples. And he said, "Blessed are you when you are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry." I think there's kind of two motivations that we see, or sort of two things we get from Jesus throughout the Gospels. One, and this is the whole season of Epiphany that we're in, is that Jesus reveals who God is and what God is like. That when you look at the life of Jesus, you get a glimpse, the clearest glimpse that we can get of what God is like. And the second is that in light of that, Jesus shows how we are to live, what it looks like to live in light of that understanding of God. And so he's got his apprentices with them, and he's entering into this crowd, and he's saying, hey, God is like this. God comes down from the mountain. God goes into the crowd of hurting people. He leans into where they are suffering. God is a healer. Like the inescapable thing, if you read the Gospels, the inescapable thing about Jesus is that he healed people. Regardless of what you think about or what that might have actually looked like, the fact is, what was known of Jesus was that he was a healer, that he fundamentally was there to restore people, to help make them whole, and that's the image that you get that God is like. And there was sort of a train of thought in Judaism at the time that if people were sinful, if people were diseased and sick, it was because they were sinful, that there was some spiritual cause for their physical ailment. You get this in John. Jesus and his disciples are walking. They come across a man who was born blind. And the disciples look at Jesus and say, why did this happen? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? And Jesus sort of disregards the question altogether. He's like, it wasn't because of his sin. It was so that I could heal him, so I could show you something about God. And so if that's sort of the view that's happening, that the suffering, the hurting, the disease, they are that way because of sin, then it is very telling. It would have been a paradigm shift for the disciples to see Jesus going into that crowd of people and healing just sort of unconditionally. If you go back to the beginning of that Luke passage, it doesn't even say that Jesus healed. It just says healing happened, like the healing power went out of him. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like, but it just says that was just a part of it. Like it didn't matter what somebody believed or didn't believe or what they did or didn't do or what they promised they were going to do or what they didn't or whether they prayed or whether they didn't. None of that mattered. They just went to Jesus and were healed. And that would be in stark contrast to what kind of the early Jewish thinkers would have thought. And so Jesus has his disciples, is doing this, and he's saying, this is what God is like. This is what I am like, and this is what you will be like. I think this passage is more descriptive than prescriptive of what it's like as a follower of Jesus. So if you are signed up to be, to try and be like Christ, if you're going to follow Jesus, if you're going to be a disciple, then are you going to be poor? I don't know where the line would be. I think our cultures are different. It's hard to see exactly, I don't know if there's a dollar amount to it, but I can tell you with near certainty, if you are following Jesus, you will have less money. You will. You'll have less money because you will be generous, because you will share with those in need. So as a result of being a follower of Christ, yeah, you will have less money. Will you be hungry? Again, I don't know. We have grocery stores, they didn't. Our food structure is very different than theirs was. But any sort of limited resource for the need of people, will you experience discomfort to make sure that those without will have some? That other people's needs are being met, even if that means less for you? Yeah, I think that's what we're signing up for as followers of Christ. That will be part of it. Will you mourn? Will you weep? Will you suffer? Yeah. You don't have to go out of your way for it. It's gonna happen when you follow Jesus' compassion and you don't allow yourself to be separated from the suffering of others. And so you get to know people in different contexts from you. You get to know people. You enter into lives that are broken and hurting. And so their mourning becomes your mourning. Their weeping is your weeping. Their suffering is your suffering. I think Jesus is saying that's what it's like if you're really going to follow me. He goes on a little bit further and says, what blessings await you when people hate you and exclude you and mock you and curse you as evil because you follow the Son of Man. That to be with people who are oppressed, you are going to experience oppression. Now, when we hear that phrase, when you follow the Son of Man, this is the New Living Translation. Other translations will say on account of the Son of Man. I think a lot of times we think that means for believing in Jesus, right? That we'll be persecuted for believing in Jesus or for going to church or for talking about Jesus. But the reality is in our country, that's not really the case. Our experience is not that we get persecuted for believing in Jesus. We will if we start living like him. You don't get persecuted for talking about Jesus. You get persecuted for talking like him. Because to talk like Jesus is to challenge systems and powers and authorities that oppress people. To live like Jesus is to stand alongside of and stand with those who are oppressed because they're of a different race or ethnicity or religious belief or sexual orientation or economic status. When you enter into and stand with those who are oppressed, you will, as a result, be oppressed by association. You'll be persecuted by association. You will experience part of that if you are serious about trying to follow Jesus, that's going to happen. It's more descriptive about where does the law of love eventually take you. If you continue to play it out, where's it going to take you? And it's going to take you here. That's what it's going to look like. And then Jesus goes on, again, talking to his disciples, and has some, you could say harsh words. I like the translation in the NRSV, so I'm reading it this way. It says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." Jesus is sort of saying, you can't be these things and be like me. Right? You can't have your cake and eat it too, in other words. Now, it's important to note, again, he's talking to his disciples, and he's talking to them in a specific socio-political economic context. So in first century Judaism, there wasn't any real parallel to what we would call the middle class. Okay, there wasn't an opportunity for upward social mobility. If you were born poor, you remained poor. If you were born rich, you remained rich. There weren't very many opportunities to change that narrative. I don't know how many there actually are in our country, but there's significantly more than there would have been then. And so Jesus is saying, if you're going to be my disciple, to be rich in that context is to perpetuate a system of extreme inequality, right? To be rich would come at the expense and the detriment of others. Again, I mentioned our food supply being different than theirs earlier. To be to be full, to be satisfied, to eat lavishly would mean that 10 others didn't get to in their time. Right? And for you to be spoken well of in that culture at that time. Well, the people that had a voice were the other social, political, religious elitists. The other folks who were rich and full. And so to be spoken well of would mean that you were probably perpetuating the status quo. You were keeping that system in place that allowed all of them to benefit, yourself included. And so, of course, you would be spoken well of in that time. So Jesus says you can't. You can't do that and, specifically the word, and be my disciple. That if we are following Jesus, that we can't participate in systems that perpetuate systemic oppression. We can't hoard resources that could be used to help and save others' lives. Right? We can't listen to voices of people who are just like us and not listen to those who are different and those who are oppressed and those who are hurting and those who are marginalized in society. We can't do those things and also be a disciple of Christ. I think that's what he's saying. It sounds shocking, but I wonder which is more shocking. Is Jesus' vision for how we are to actually live our lives more shocking? Or is that this is what God is like? This is what God is actually like. Is that more shocking? That God in Christ humbles himself. He enters into suffering. He goes to the people who are forgotten in their culture. He willingly stands up to corruption to the point that he willingly goes to the cross. That he is willing to forgive no matter the cost or the consequence. That God is like that. That God is fundamentally loving, fundamentally self-giving. And so if God is like that, then that's how we are to be, if we are going to be like Jesus. Now, I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know how many of you are like, I didn't sign up to be a disciple. Give me option B. So I don't know where you're at. Maybe you're just here checking things out. Maybe you're not even sure where you're at with God and this church thing. And I want you to know that's okay. That God's posture towards you doesn't change. He's unconditionally loving means without condition. Right? There's nothing we do to change the posture of God's love towards us. And so, wherever you're at this morning, you could be like the crowd, right? The crowd goes to Jesus and they experience being healed, right? The disciples follow Jesus and they experience getting to be healers. And that's my hope and prayer for our church, that we are all welcome here wherever you're at, that God's posture of love doesn't change wherever you're at, but that Jesus' invitation is always going to be to more, is always going to be to follow me more, towards loving others, to reflect the perfect love of God as best we can. So my question for you this morning is related. I think this is this text creates a good sort of litmus test. It's a way to sort of take stock of your life for a second. So I want you to think, if you are following Christ, is your life characteristic of the kind of self-giving love that Jesus modeled? Not perfect. None of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes, but to be characteristic, to more often than not be the kind of person that is self-giving love. And if not, I would relate this question back to Mike's from last week. Have you had enough exposure to Jesus to trust him in that? I think the invitation for all of us is we are loved wherever we are at, but we are invited to participate in something more. And that's my hope for us.